Once you start looking, it's surprising just how many buildings in Dorchester have an inscribed date on their front elevations. The most prominent one, of course, is the White Hart, which you can see here in the High Street. But that's not the date that it was built. That marks a different stage in its development. The White Hart is much, much earlier than 1691. It's a late medieval coaching inn, and competition was really fierce in Dorchester between all the coaching inns. So they were constantly updated and modernised to attract custom. And what you're seeing here is a facelift of the White Hart. It included extra accommodation in the roof, so those three gables are really a loft extension. It involved removing the wattle and daub from between the timber frame and inserting brick, which gave the opportunity for decorative patterns, herringbones, diamonds and so on, and to celebrate this facelift with the date in darker bricks. But if you look at the fabric closely, you can see the evidence for the earlier building, particularly the windows. Just look at the vertical timbers, and if you look very closely, you'll see that there's a groove that runs upwards, and at the top of that, there's a cut-off tenon from a mortise and tenon joint. And if you look along the whole facade, there's a whole array of these grooves and cut-off tenons. And what they show is that there were projecting oriel windows at first floor level that gave a lot more light into the rooms behind. Those have been removed. They were removed in the 1691 renovation. We can see what these windows might originally have looked like if we move further down the High Street and look at the Bull Inn, which of course was another coaching inn in rivalry with the White Hart. And this too was given a facelift by a brand new extension. The building behind me is probably the best timber frame building in Dorchester. And it wasn't built as a house. It was built as an extension to the Bull Inn, and the Bull Inn is the building to its north. That's clearly a late medieval timber-framed coaching inn in competition with the White Hart. And in the early 17th century, it was extended by this residential block here. And there's a date on it. If we come across and look at it, here in the timber frame, you can see the date 1610 and the initials IH. I probably stands for a J. That's how it was written in the 17th century. So it's probably John somebody. We don't know quite who it was. But that date is the date of this building here. And as I say, it was built as an annex to the Bull Inn. The front door is a later insertion. It had no doors on this elevation. And on both floors, it had a whole range of windows for which the evidence is still very clear. You can see one of the smaller windows there, and there. You've got to imagine there was another one, and there was another one. And if you come here, you can see the mortises to support a window coming out in this direction, another mortise to hold the bottom of it, and there are the same mortises there. And then if you look up above, you can see that there's a pegged mortise for the structure coming down there, and another one there, and then the empty mortises for the glazing bars. So there was a projecting window, two on either side, the same there. And then if you look up above, it was exactly the same there. So if you look at a reconstruction drawing, you can see just how much glass there was on the front here. That must have drawn attention to the Bull Inn, but so much glass meant that it was really far too hot in the summer in the rooms behind and too cold in the winter. And also timber, it's difficult to believe now, but timber became terribly old-fashioned in Dorchester, and nearly every building they covered up the timber. They didn't want you to see that it was timber. So the whole of this building was rendered so that you couldn't see the timber frame, and the windows were reduced in size. And it wasn't until 1975 that that render was taken off, the timber frame was exposed together with the date. So for a long period that was covered up, and it was the same at the White Hart. It was only, I think, in about 1952 that they took the render off the timber frame there, and the date 1691 was revealed. On the other side of the street, nearly all of these buildings are timber framed, but they've been covered up so you can't see any timber frame. You can see at the far end the Crown Inn. That was another of these coaching inns. There, instead of putting render over the timber frame, they've actually covered it up with a whole new brick facade, which if you look at the roof line, you can see that it's just skin deep. And we'll go and have a look at another building in Dorchester that's had just the same treatment. We're now in Bridge End, and here's another of the timber-framed houses in Dorchester where the timber frame has been covered up. So the beautiful inscribed date that you see of 1715 with the initials of the owners refers not to when the house was first built. It was probably built about 100 years earlier, and this is a modernisation in 1715, proudly displayed, but it's only skin deep. There's just a brick and flint elevation using the fashionable materials of the time. Behind it, the timber frame building is still intact. And if you look at that front elevation, it tells you more than that. A very, very delicate date plaque like that would not have been deliberately placed off-centre. And if you look carefully at the brickwork and at the pattern of the flint, then to one side is a later extension. So you've got to imagine the cottage being very much shorter and with that date plaque in the centre. And if you come and look at one elevation, you will see that the front is only skin deep, and you can see the timber frame building behind. Just look at the roof line as it goes behind. It's slightly kinked halfway down. That's to give you a lean-to outshot at the back, possibly a scullery. If we go and look at the other end, you will see that the roof line at the back goes down in a straight line, and that it's hard cement render on the outside here. So this is a later addition, but you can still see the brick facade on the corner. This grand house in Bridge End is on what was the main road down to the medieval bridge, and it's not timber framed. It's entirely of brick, very expensively built. If you look closely, you will see that the bricks on the front elevation are all headers. That's the short side of the brick. And they're all glazed so that they sparkle in the sunshine. That gives you a nice dark pattern. The roof line with what's called a gambrel roof gives you much more generous accommodation in the attic. So it's 3 stories high, and it's got a very elegant date stone over the front door, which we'll go and have a look at. Just above the front door, and partly hidden by the foliage, is the elegantly carved date of 1797 within a circle. And that's deliberately placed, and it's central on the house. But what's intriguing about this house is that it was extended 100 years later. And if you go round the back, there is another date stone for 1897, so exactly 100 years later. And what's intriguing is that that date stone is carved in exactly the same way. So it raises the question, Is the date stone that we're looking at above the front door original, and was it just copied 100 years later, or were both date stones put up 100 years later, in which case we can't trust the date over the front door? And what's even more intriguing to me is that in 1997 this house was sold, and I was desperate that someone would put up another extension and put another date stone on it so that you had another date exactly 100 years later, but it didn't happen. Hidden in Samian Way is mollymops, and behind that high hedge is another date stone. The date 1701 would fit the form of the house, but that elegant profile head above it makes me rather suspicious. I think this is a more modern date stone. It might have been recarved. It could well have been that the original date stone was in chalk and that had eroded, and that this is a modern replacement. But I'd be happy with 1701 as the date that this house was built. Some dates can be confusing. We're looking now at Dorchester Bridge. The toll house was built to exact tolls from people crossing this bridge, because this is a new bridge built in the 19th century. It curves away because there was already a medieval bridge which had to remain in position until they built this new bridge. Underneath the bridge is a date stone, very delicately carved. You can only see it by boat, but I do have a transcription of it. And it tells us that in October 1811, the first stone was laid on the ovary side, and that in September 1812, the first stone was laid on the Dorchester side. Now, the 1811 date is very puzzling because the advert asking for building contractors to tender for building the bridge isn't published in Jackson's Oxford Journal until April 1812. So after that 1811 date, and then the contractors are employed, and the bridge is designed then. So it's not finished until 1815. We know that. That's why it's called locally the Waterloo Bridge. But is the 1811 date a mark of an abortive scheme to build a different bridge? And then in 1812, this bridge was designed and contracted for and built. But it's a puzzle. Some of the date stones, of course, celebrate momentous events and have nothing to do with the date that a building was built. Here on the toll house, which was built round about 1820, we have an inscribed date and a mark here which shows the flood level in 1820 something. I can't quite distinguish what the last letter is, but it's telling you that the floodwaters came up to that level from the River Tame. And round the side of the toll house, we've got another date stone with another date showing you the flood level then. That date stone is very much clearer. Here at the George, there is the date 1495 on the inn sign. Obviously, that's a modern date, but it's probably a good guess as to when the George was built. Again, like so many of these coaching inns, it was modernised in the 17th century. The timber frame, and it's fully timber framed, that's all been covered up by render, and that hasn't been removed, and it's still got its sash windows. So this is, you're seeing the George, probably 1495, and then modified somewhere round about 1600, and again round about 1700. Here in the rectory, we have the date 1857, and there can be no doubt that this is the date that it was built, because we have the documents to prove it. It was built for the Reverend McFarland, who was appointed in 1856, the year earlier, and he insisted that he was going to live in the parish, and he needed a rectory that was appropriate to his status, and so he paid for it himself. McFarlane was a bachelor, and when he moved into the rectory, he brought his sister Jessie with him to act as his housekeeper. Jessie was a spinster, and she lived in the lower part of the vicarage, which was built just to house her in a separate household. Together, they shared half the wealth that their father had made in the East India Company, and they had no children to spend it on. So, in a way, Dorchester became their family, and they used their money partly to restore the abbey, partly to build other buildings in the village, and we will go and look at one of them now. In 1870, education was made compulsory for young children, and the McFarlanes responded by building a new school for the girls and the infants in the village. It's here behind me. It was built in 1871. They paid for it. It was designed by Gilbert Scott, who was restoring the abbey, and it's got a very discreet date stone. This is the boys' school. It wasn't built until 1896, and by then McFarlane was dead and his sister had moved into Oxford. But it still has a date stone. But the date stone says schoolhouse. Now, I think that means it's a modern date stone. It certainly wouldn't have said schoolhouse when it was the boys' school, and I think that dates from when it was converted into a house only about 20 years ago. Further down Queen Street, there's this modest pair of semi-detached cottages with quite the most elaborate date stone in the whole village. As late as 1889, this must have been a speculative development, and the developer is so pleased with his design that he even put fancy keystones over the windows and over the doors and gave them the name Abbey Cottages. They're quite a distance away from the Abbey, and they don't look out over the Abbey at all, but they are very handsome cottages all the same. Of all the coaching inns in the village, the George is the best placed for pilgrim traffic because it's directly opposite the main entrance to the Abbey. But the Lich Gate that you can now see in front of the Abbey dates from the 19th century and was part of McFarlane's improvements to the Abbey. It's dated 1867, and we know from McFarlane's diary that that is indeed when it was built, designed by Scott, the architect. The date is not easy to find, but there's a date that's even more difficult to find, and that's at the top of the tower to the Abbey. This apparently has the date stone 1602 and the initials RW. I haven't seen it, and it's not the date that the tower was built because, of course, the Abbey had been dissolved by then. It's the date of refurbishment to the tower of the Abbey when it was a parish church. All the date stones we've seen so far have been very carefully sculptured to look sophisticated on a building. But here in Rotten Row, we've got scratched date stones or date bricks, which could almost be taken for graffiti. And in fact, there is graffiti on some of the buildings here. But if we look at this building, Willow Tree Cottage, we will see that there's a brick on the corner, and that has the initials and the date 1780. That date, I'm fairly certain, was impressed on the brick before it had been fired. So it's a local brick. It's been specially commissioned. They've impressed the initials and the date, and then they've built it into the building where you see it as you come off the street of Rotten Row. The form of the building, I'm very happy. 1780 is absolutely right for a building like this. It's not one of those disguised timber frame buildings that we've seen earlier in Dorchester. This is a much later house, and it's built of imported bricks that have come in from the Midlands with a Welsh slate roof. So this house dates from after the railway came to Oxfordshire, and those materials were then more cheaply available. The scratch date of 1860 has just been scratched into the brick. It's an ordinary brick, and they've put the initials 1860. But they've placed this brick so high up that it can't possibly be graffiti. So I am fairly positive that 1860 is the right date for this building, originally built as a butcher's shop with a slaughterhouse attached. And down below, you can see some ordinary graffiti. That's within reach of somebody with a penknife, but 1860 is far too high for that. The tradition of dating buildings with inscriptions continues into the 20th century. And here you have the date 1909 with the initials of the Brown family. This building is said to have been built as a sweet shop and a tea room. So it reflects the beginnings of the tourist trade into Dorchester. The lettering is very much cruder than the ones we've been looking at from the 19th and earlier centuries. All of the date stones that we've seen have also had the initials of those who've put them in place. But it's very difficult to find out anything about those people. This is an exception. This is back on the High Street. And this is a date, 1984, so it's fairly modern. It's the date that it was restored, that the render was taken away from the timber frame, revealing the decorative brickwork underneath. And that restoration was carried out for a man called Charles Mould, who was secretary of the Bodleian Library. And it's characteristic of Charles that he's made his inscription in Latin. Some inscribed dates can deceive even the most sceptical but experienced historian. And I'm no exception. This house here in the High Street, Clementine Cottage, I still remember my excitement when I first went inside and found inscribed in the timber over the fireplace the date 1527 and a very convincing looking 16th century merchant's mark. That excited me because with a cottage as small as this, you didn't expect it to have an enclosed fireplace that early. And I wrote it up in a book on the buildings of Dorchester, saying how extraordinary it was that this house was so early. And then I bumped into somebody in the village, Paul Krushko. His father had lived in this cottage. He was a woodworker. And Paul said to me, "Oh yes," he said, "my dad carved that during the war." So there you are. 1527 certainly convinced me. There was a time when a later owner of the house actually painted that date on the outside, but that's now gone. So you've got to be careful when you're looking at date stones. They don't always tell you the full story.